Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be going over the history and geography of Somalia. Just a quick disclaimer, just a little personal note. This little script that I write like an outline so that it sounds more natural when I talk. I've been working on it for nearly a week now, which is longer than I've done for any country because Somalia's history in the past 60 years or so has been a bit tumultuous. It's been extremely tumultuous and it's not relaxing whatsoever. So I've done my best to try to make it relaxing, but it's been really difficult. So doing my best here with what I've got. Let's start off with geography. Let's go south to north. Somalia, I know, like, when you think of Somalia, you think of, like, desert and camels, which you rightly should, but this main region all down here is actually quite green. It's got some very humid and lush forests. I mean, it does border Kenya right here, so, you think of, like, the forests and grasslands of Kenya. It's a lot like that. You can even see some of the lines right here. This is actually a wetland, like a marshy kind of wetland. Lots of rivers and things like that in this region, which is much different from the rest of Somalia. This is also where we find the capital city of Mogadishu. This river right here is the Schabelle River, the longest river in Somalia, and it literally kind of slices it into these two different sections over here. This area all up here is a very flat plateau land. You can see up here it's called the Haud. It's very, I should say, like flat and plateau-like. And then it gets a little more complicated up here. So this right here, you can see it says Puntland. This region calls itself Puntland, but it is part of Somalia and still considers itself part of Somalia, but it is an autonomous region, which means that they control themselves, they have their own government and capital and what have you. They run themselves with some slight control of the rest of Somalia. And we'll find out why that is in its history. But this region is pretty mountainous up here. And then the rest of the region over here is also very dry and mountainy, rocky. This is, as you can see, Somaliland. And Somaliland is a region of Somalia that has declared independence. But not one country in the world recognizes it as an independent nation. So it functions as its own very autonomous region to the point where they have like their own passports, they have their own president and government, and have been doing their own thing since 1991, which again we'll talk about that in its history. There is a lot of mountainy areas up here, and there's actually some really beautiful green mountainy areas up here. The highest point in Somalia and Somaliland, we could say, is, let me find it exactly, right here. Sorry, I'm looking at my cat drinking water. It's very hot in here. We've been going through a heat wave. It's easily about 90 degrees Fahrenheit in my apartment right now. It's pretty hot. But this mountain is called Shimbiris, and it's really beautiful. These mountains, I think, are my favorite part of Somalia, but it is kind of this region over here where you think of like the camels and rocky, deserty area, sort of. You know what I mean. The largest city in this area and the capital of Somaliland is Hargeisa. It would be the second largest city in all of Somalia. But what Somalia is really known for is its coastline. It has the longest coastline in continental Africa. The longest being Madagascar, since it's an island. There are lots of really important coastal cities, but the most important would be Berbera right here, right on the Gulf of Aden. And there's lots of other ones here along the Indian Ocean. This area of the Indian Ocean is called the Somali Sea. I think, well, you can barely see, it says Somali Basin right here. That's the plate that this area of land sits on. But let's see. There's lots of other little parts of Somalia that are kind of going autonomous as well, but not officially. Like this area down here is known as Jubaland. There's southwestern Somalia. I guess there's also the central region state they're calling themselves. It's interesting how it's all breaking apart, and again, you're going to find out why. Also, if you can see, this border right here is dotted, and that's because it's a disputed border. You can also see this part of Ethiopia that it borders is called Somali. And this region and part of the southern region here of Djibouti, the other country that it borders, is referred to as Greater Somalia, mostly by the Somalis. But we're all going to find out the details of that in its history again. It's not complicated, it's just kind of sad. But I'm going to make it as relaxing as possible for you guys. So let's just dive right in and go through the history. So what's really interesting, in my opinion, about Somalia is up here near Hargeisa. We have some of the oldest cave art paintings in the world, and they're so cool. It's known as Laskil, and the art on one hand is beautiful, on the other hand it has pictures of certain cows that have gone extinct. It's so cool. It's so neat to see. But if you're like an Egyptology nerd, you know about the land of Punt, which, I mean, spoiler alert. But it was a region that they traded with and they loved, and have drawings of pictures from Punt and stories and hieroglyphs about how great the trade with Punt is, but they never wrote down where it was. So it's very, very highly suspected that it was in this area in the Horn of Africa. What was it? It was some mummified monkeys, I want to say, that scientists have looked at their genes and they match with monkeys from Somalia. It's very believed that this whole area over here is the land of Punt. There's another land, though, called Macrobia that the Persians and Greeks wrote about, which is also believed to be in this area. It was Herodotus actually wrote that the Macrobians were like the most handsome people in the world. I couldn't really find any sources about how archaeologists and historians believe that Macrobia would have been in what is today Somalia, but the Macrobians are also very famous for their trade, and they traded with India, China, Persia, obviously Greece and Rome and Egypt, and everyone. So as history goes on, all of the ports over here also trade with those regions. So I think that's why there's that connection. Islam was introduced into Somalia pretty early in its history. Up here in this region was a city known as Zela, and it's where the oldest mosque in Africa was built. Don't quote me on that, because I saw some sources say it is the oldest, and I saw some that said it's believed to be the oldest. So I like to think it's the oldest mosque in Africa. That's really cool. And you can even, I don't know if you can see, but it says right about here that it's the site of the Adal Sultanate. And the Adal Sultanate ruled a vast area up here. And that could be a whole video in and of itself, because it had a really interesting and long history. And it also waged some jihads against the Abyssinians, which is today Ethiopia, since they were Christian and they were Islam. And it went back and forth for a long time, up until the 1500s or so, where one side would defeat the other, and the other would retaliate and fight back and defeat that one, and it went back and forth for a long, long time. And over time, it really wore down the the Adal Sultanate in every way you can imagine that non-stop invasions and wars would do. So it did weaken over time. But down here, sort of gaining prominence as the Adal Sultanate was starting to dwindle down. Over here we had the Ajuran Sultanate. And like I said, they really thrived off of trade in a big way. Like I said, with India, with China, with the Near East, with, like anyone you could reach by the ocean, even like as far as Indonesia even. And there are lots of other little sultanates down here. There's like the Mogadishu Sultanate. And yeah, this area was really, really thriving. Vasco da Gama sailed by and noted how Mogadishu was like this huge flourishing city, like almost in like how we imagine cities today being, like highly urbanized, tall buildings, full of people, things like that. And it remained that way until the Berlin Conference of 1884, which is also known as the Scramble for Africa, where many European powers got together and literally laid out a map of Africa, and over those days picked out what parts they wanted to conquer. So I believe it was the British that were interested in this area, and then the French were interested in this area, along with the Italians also. But there was, a thriving people already living here, really on par with like the British and French and everything. In 1895, the Darwish were formed. The Darwish Tariqa were essentially like lawyers in a way, like a court system that was formed, and their government was called the Haroun. And one of their main missions was to stop the British from invading, and they did so for a long time. There were 4 huge pushes by the British to take over the area, and they were defeated every time. The Italians came in and they pushed them back. The Abyssinians came in since they were allied with the Europeans, and they pushed them back. And it wasn't until 1920 when the British finally came in with air power and defeated them and took over the northern part. No, they took over like this, what was it? Like more of like this area. Because the French had, this was French Somaliland up here. But anyway, it's hard to see now with all the different borders. It's completely different now, but more of the northern area was British Somaliland. Then the fascist Italian government decided to invade the area. And, it's another long, it could be a whole history of the Italians trying to conquer Somalia and them getting just like constantly owned nonstop until they didn't. And they did manage to take over the more southerny area of Somalia, and it was called Italian Somaliland, and it was formed in 1923. They used this to invade Abyssinia in 1935 and take over that region. And then in 1940, during World War II, they invaded British Somaliland, which the British managed to recapture in 1941. So after World War II happens, and the Potsdam Conference, I believe, and the United Nations also decided what to do with this territory. And they decided that the British would hold British Somaliland, and they would deal with it sort of like, a colony, and would eventually rejoin the rest of Italian Somaliland. The rest was placed under Italian trusteeship with the promise that in 10 years it would become an independent country. The areas were run a bit differently because the Italian government really wanted them to be set up. So, there was their own government and parties and establishing a way of life, whereas in the British area it was more very controlled by the British. And this is when the British sell this chunk of land to what is now Ethiopia, which the Somalis were not happy about at all, especially since there are many Somalis living here and still live there to this day. I know there's one point where Britain even tried to buy it back, but anyway. On July 1st, 1960, Somalia became independent and this whole region became one country. And I did mention in my Djibouti video that I believe it was the day that Somalia gained its independence that Djibouti held a referendum whether or not to join Somalia or not. They voted to stay with France, but check out that video for those details. But the whole thing with the countries being ran in two different ways did not mesh well together at all because, the government in Mogadishu had laid out all these plans that these people hadn't agreed to, and, they voted and passed on an election, but the majority of people up here didn't approve of it, and it was just very tense at the time. In 1969, the president was assassinated. A coup was led by the head of the military, Siad Barre. He created the Somali Democratic Republic, which was a socialist state. Really interesting. It was called scientific socialism, where they combined essentially socialism with Sharia law to make like an Islamic communist country, which kind of worked in a way, but also, it was a tense time to start a new communist country. But they were also really intent on getting this land back. So in 1977, the Ogaden War occurred when Somalia invaded this area to reclaim it. And they did actually push really far. Actually made it up to Harar when the Soviet army got involved with their friends here in Ethiopia and pushed the Somali army back entirely. Which, in a way, allowed Somalia to be a participant in the Cold War, because then they sided with the United States after that and formed an alliance. And, the United States really funneled a lot of resources into Somalia to support them. But once the Cold War started to fizzle out at the end of the 80s, the United States sort of disregarded a lot of its ties with Somalia and just kind of left them hanging, which really weakened the government. A lot of resistance movements sprung up due to that. And the Somalia Civil War started in 1990, I believe, and is still going on to this day. Barre fled the country in 1991, just sort of left everything in a huge state of chaos in a way. So this is when Somaliland declared its independence and just said, we're not going to be a part of this chaos and we're just going to be our own country. And that's how they've ran themselves ever since. Many rebel groups and guerrilla armies formed to take over parts of Somalia and try to establish themselves as the primary government. But nobody really rose to prominence. You can imagine all of the war and chaos that ensued in the area, not to mention the devastation of the civilian population. There were many attempts to establish a government, not the violent way, but the official way, by having conferences mainly in Djibouti to elect presidents. The first one they elected actually passed away a few months ago after contracting COVID-19. But anyway, whenever they established a government, it would in a way fail, or the head would resign and they'd have to start all over again. And it was in the 1990s that the UN classified Somalia as a failed state. I guess the more politically correct term now is fragile state, but that's what it was called back then. The UN, with the aid of the United States, sent many different humanitarian aid campaigns into Somalia to help out the people living here until a more stable government could be formed. But many of the rebels and guerrilla leaders fought back against the UN peacekeepers and humanitarian workers. And was a huge mess, as you can imagine. More reconciliation summits were held in the 1990s and through the 2000s, but it didn't do much at that time. And then you can imagine the refugees. There's over 1 million refugees in the surrounding countries. There's over 1 million, I know it's 1.1 million IDPs, or internally displaced peoples, that have mainly gone into Somaliland. And this is when the piracy really starts to escalate. Somalia today is really associated with pirates in that way. And terrorist organizations also really took advantage of the instability in the area and started to take over parts. And many Islamist extremist groups formed. This is where Al-Shabaab still has control over some parts. There's even a civil war between the Islamist terrorist organizations at one point in 2009. It's really chaotic, as you can imagine. So 2008 was when people really decided to make a government that sticks, and they set up a transitional government that worked from 2008 and was officially a thing in by 2012, I should say. But it's another one of those things where they managed to gain control, to get back into Mogadishu, and then they'd be driven out by terrorists, and that's pretty much where we are today in Somalia, to be honest. I got really sad researching, and I didn't write a lot of notes about the 2010s because it was just really, really sad. I mean, there was even a suicide bombing a few days ago, since I'm recording this, literally 2 days ago. Most of this area down here is controlled by Al-Shabaab. Some is controlled by the government. Obviously, these places up here are doing their own thing because they don't want to get involved, and thankfully they've been, for the most part, spared of many different terrorist attacks because of that. The current president was supposed to be up for re-election this year in 2021, but decided to extend his presidency for, I think, 2 more terms. There have been protests. There was a military uprising. When was it? A month? Last month there was, and it must have been 2 months ago because I think it ended May 2021. But it's a whole thing. So that's where Somalia is today. I really tried to make this as relaxing as I could. It's really a sad situation, but to put my personal opinion in, I think that honestly you need that kind of really strong government, not authoritarian to the point of total dominance. There was a part that I skipped over deliberately because it's sad, but there was a genocide waged up in Somaliland. 90% of Hargeisa was destroyed. I think there was around, I don't want to say the number, but it's in the hundreds of thousands who lost their lives during that. It's such a sad history. It's really upsetting, but yeah, not that kind of authoritarian government, but a very strong government is really what's needed to help this area. And, efforts and assistance from other countries as well wouldn't be too bad. I know other countries have lended support, and they kind of gave up, most especially the United States. But yeah, one of the presidents that resigned blamed the international community for the failure of not becoming a full government and not ending the transitional government in the time of the deadline that they set. But anyway, I'm going to start rambling if I don't stop. So thank you so much for watching. I really hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good